Welcome back. Another podcast.
Nerve-wracking podcast.
Ooh.
A spicy podcast.
Yes, we're talking about sex. Where do Christians go to learn about good sex? This actually has an explicit warning on it.
What are we rating it?
Well, it gets the E. I'm giving it the E, not because I want to be lewd in this podcast, but because I want to be frank,
Yep.
not beans. And
Stop it.
we're gonna have an honest conversation, not about the theology of sex.
Why not?
Because there's a whole bunch of great podcasts on that. What
Okay.
I want to have a conversation about is where Christians who potentially have issues within their sex life go to learn about good sex.
You're talking about less the theology and more the mechanics.
Nuts and bolts.
Yep. Okay.
That's the conversation.
That's two puns now that you've just dropped. Can we?
No, I'm keeping them coming. It's got an E rating.
Oh my
It's
gosh.
got an E rating.
I apologize in advance, and I subtly distance myself from Duncan in this episode.
Okay.
No,
all right.
no.
No, I think
Love
it's
you,
going to be
brother.
a good one.
Yep. No, I think it's good and I'll talk about this, but we decided to do this episode 3 weeks ago, and in the meantime, I actually went to a conference and heard a sexologist talk, which was very timely and providential. So
Excellent.
I thank God for that. Before we get into the topic of sex, our sharing question today is, what is your favorite childhood memory?
I used to get home. So I lived on the bush, backed onto the bush, backed onto Garrigal National Park, and I would get home from school, and it was a long journey back from school, about an hour. And when I got home, I would walk straight out into the bushland, and off the back of our property was a fruit and garden bed, and then below that you could get onto a rock cliff. And I could sit at the top of the rock cliff in this little divot that had it was like an armchair. And I would sit there and just stare out at the bush. And so one of my favorite childhood memories is getting home from school and immediately walking out into bushland. I was chased by brown snakes, stumbled across a funnel web nest. It was just wild stuff happened.
Yep.
But it was just me in creation, and I loved every moment of that. And sometimes I just feel like one of the reasons we live where we live is because there's days where I just walk out into the bush.
And your kids open the app that has the bush scene on their iPad when they get home instead.
Just start Minecraft.
Virtual bush.
Yeah, building it in Minecraft or Roblox.
And just adding a roller coaster and pillaging the bush that way.
Yeah, I'm like, it's just right here. We could go into it. So, that's my
that's
favorite
cool.
childhood. What about you?
I feel like yours is such a natural. I'm going to my inner Italian's going to contrast yours. Just
Hosing the concrete driveway.
polishing that concrete,
Just
buffing
glorious.
it clean, seeing my reflection is nothing better.
There was a little boy fountain that was peeing in the backyard, just standing there and admiring.
Yeah.
So, just
Why have 4 columns when you can have 5 at the front of your house? No, it's not far off though. Just extended family dinners, lunches, lasagna, Italian style.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Nonna plating you up with so much food and then asking you why you're so fat was a common trajectory that she would overfeed you and then fat shame you. It was psychologically destructive. But I'm not even joking.
Absolute gangster of a grandma.
Seriously. But yeah, just those memories. And I said it at my wedding to my family in the speech. It's that will always be my favorite moment. Just laughing and sometimes fighting, always eating.
Beautiful.
It's just glorious.
Awesome.
Yep.
Okay. Where are we starting with this thing?
Well, let's go with the elephant scale. Where do you place yourself out of 10 on this topic of where do Christians learn about sex, and why is that your score?
I'm probably at about a 6, and I
Okay.
wish I was at a 10. But I think that's part of the reason I want to say it.
Yeah.
So, is that I feel it's actually a significant pastoral problem.
You're working on an assumption, this being an elephant in the room, we don't talk about it enough.
Yes.
We don't have a safe space to talk about it, and therefore we are not as well versed on it as we should be.
Yeah. So I think there's a conglomeration of issues that means that this is probably not spoken about as much as it should be.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I'm a 5. I don't really know why. Like, I guess I'm hedging my bets with this because I don't know where we're going to go with the conversation.
Okay.
But I'll start with the 5. I guess I've done a lot of marriage prep with couples as a pastor, and this does come up. Yes, there is a theology of sex component to it, but there is an expectations of sex to it.
Yes.
Specifically around, how easy or difficult will it be, especially early on?
Mm-hmm.
How are you both feeling emotionally about going on this journey together?
Yep.
So I do have a pastoral, I've been married 15 years. So yeah, there's experience here, but without knowing exactly where we want to go with this conversation, I'll stay at a 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're the one who's really pushed for this
Yes.
episode to be done. So just frame it up for us. Where is the felt need around this conversation for you?
Okay. So I feel like for the most part, if we were to frame up a theological understanding of sex, we could do that quite well.
And what would that be? Just so we can.
Mate, if I was going to just really dull it down and make it stupid simple, it'd be like there is an expression of sexuality that is healthy within the boundaries of marriage, and we want to encourage you to live in a way that shapes that being the most pure and holy expression of sexuality. Okay,
Sure.
it's a biblically instituted kind of
Sure.
thing. Here's where I think it starts to cause our challenges, is that if we're addressing scripture and we're looking at when people are getting married, that has significantly changed. You're talking about teenagers getting wed in biblical times.
Yeah.
That has shifted now, especially within Australia, to what, late 20s, early 30s? I can't think of it. The last person I've married who was 20 years old. Like, they're all 30. So, which when we partner that with purity culture, and our desire for people to abstain from sex until marriage, that there is a significant challenging pressure that gets put on that. And as we start to eke that out further and further and further, that when we do get to a place of marriage, that overcoming this prohibition purity culture into an expression where there is liberation
Yeah.
is really challenging.
When you've got 30 years of learned behavior before you make that switch.
Totally. And then when you do make that switch and it doesn't go well,
Which it often doesn't.
you don't know who to speak to about it, because what we frame up is the theology of good sex as opposed to a practical understanding of the challenges that can come up in the expression of sexuality.
Yeah.
And so then I will have private conversations with people who will express challenges with sexuality. I am not a trained sexologist. I don't know who to point them to. And that's where the challenge is.
Okay.
And so what I'm saying is, I think we need to have a healthy place where married couples within Christian circles can have honest conversations about the practicalities of sex, where they can champion good sex. So I go and see a Christian psychologist because it may be physical, it may be mental, it may be spiritual. I think that we should have an abundance of Christian sexologists, not these random unicorns that we point to, but I would love every church to have some kind of registered Christian sexologist. When someone says, hey, listen, I need to talk about some bedroom issues, I can go, I am not qualified. I'm learning.
Yeah.
Here's a person to go to, but what I have to do is triage the situation short term, because I get these people.
Which is what pastors probably should do in the mental health space. They're largely a triage.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's good ministry.
And so I've given some really terrible practical sexual advice that when I speak to a sexologist, not a Christian sexologist, because I don't know a whole bunch of them, they go, that's terrible advice. and that's destructive.
Can I just ask what kind of terrible advice you've given in the past?
So it's not unusual for a individual, for a girl who has sex for the first time and for the first few times, to have a significant amount of pain in sex. And there's actually a medical reason for that. And there's a way that you can deal with that. And if you're unskilled with that, you can just suggest keep trying
Sure.
until it feels better.
Yeah.
which is a really rudimentary understanding of sexuality. So they're
Well-meaning but unskilled.
yeah. So if you sorry, it's explicit, but if you think of sexuality purely as penetration, then you have a real rudimentary understanding of what sexuality is and the delight of expression of sexuality between a man and a woman. Song of Solomon would have been a lot shorter book if that was their understanding. But
There's a lot of foreplay in Song of Solomon, is your point.
Foreplay, the touching. You can do a whole bunch within the realm of sexuality before you get to penetration, and that's the thing where I feel like people go.
And I suppose it's, to be fair to ourselves, that's where our culture has largely gone.
Well, yeah, because the cultural penetration of pornography, and I'm sorry, there's a better word, I'm sure, has meant that we have a stilted understanding of what sexuality is. And not only that, we have this understanding that girls are just ready for it.
Yeah.
And the thing is the way your brain is wired is that there's a long journey to that pleasurable experience of sexuality, which God has hardwired in.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's really important to just pause on for a second. And like, the reason this is not a lewd conversation is because what we know about good sex is given to us because God has provided our biological makeup, our reproductive organs, our sensory systems. It's we're not being gross. Like it was God's idea. Take it up with him.
Yeah, and so what I feel for is the young couple who's been on the journey, who have said to themselves, we're going to abstain until we're married. And then there's this delightful moment on the wedding night, and stuff happens on the wedding night that you may not expect. And some girls, have this incredible pain, and you're like, oh, I thought this was going to be a special night.
Yeah.
And it is a special night, but you've never had any proper practical understanding of sexuality, and so you panic.
Yeah.
Oh, what has happened? Have I heard?
Is there something wrong with me?
Is there something wrong with me? And
is it always going to be like this?
Exactly. And so then you've got all these expectations about the joy of what it's going to be, and then it's not what you hoped it would be, and then you're trying to reframe that. Not only that, you're trying to find the delight that maybe Song of Solomon is speaking to. Maybe, and I think I can say this pretty well, that for a lot of men, pornography has existed in the build-up to this.
Yep.
And it has sadly reshaped your understanding of what sexuality is. And so you go on this beautiful long journey to get to the destination, and it sucks the first time.
Yep.
And then you feel some kind of degree of shame or concern about that. It stunts your sex life. And then because you don't know who to talk to, and this feels like a shameful topic, it's not at all. You don't know where to go. And then some people are brave enough to book a conversation with me.
Yep.
And I'm like, holy smokes, this is a big topic of conversation. And you're sitting there talking about, like I could have a conversation about shalom, and the next minute I'm talking about cunnilingus with a married couple. And I'm like, gosh, I don't feel like I'm the appropriate person to do this with, but you also don't know where the appropriate place to go. And I think a Christian sexologist has a healthy framework for addressing that, whereas a secular psychologist maybe has other elements within that.
Yeah, there's a worldview that they are coming from within their practice
that may not be helpful for you as you sit under this kind of Christian understanding of sexuality. And so, I think one of the best things about waiting until you're married, and this is not a chastity conversation, okay? So there's a lot more grace in the room than it might sound like. The way God inclines it is that when you're married, there's an opportunity to grow in your sexuality.
Yes.
So for Christians who abstain and then get married, most of the sex in their life takes place after they're married.
Yep.
For most couples who don't do that, which is a large portion of the conversation, you have all this wild sex before you get married, and the married becomes the practicality of having children.
Yeah.
And so you have way less sex after you get married. Okay? It's like fact. And so you go, well, which is the better option? Do you want way more sex after you get married or way less sex after you get married? I would like the first option.
Well, and as much as, and I don't want to hijack this purely with the theology of it, but I can't help myself for a moment. I think the theological touch point of all of this that you didn't refer to earlier is around the idea of covenant.
Yes.
And so the Christian understanding of marriage, when you make those wedding vows, the reason it's significant, you're making them before God and others, and it's a covenant. And a covenant is a binding agreement. To put it more in layman's terms, my mentor said to me once, it's not love that sustains marriage, it's marriage that sustains love. So in other words, the commitment that you make on your wedding day is to say, I will work out how to love you at different seasons of my life. And it's that commitment that is going to drive the decision and the practice to love you. Tim Keller talks about this in his Meaning for Marriage book, that he and Kathy had to work out like 5 different times how to fall in love back with each other. And he talks about, there was one moment in our marriage when we were both in remission from cancer, right? And he even talks in the DVD around that, around like sexual activity at that time. And he doesn't go fully for it, but he's got this cheeky smile on his face, and he's kind of alluding to the fact that we had to find alternative methods to pleasure each other sexually. When we were in remission from cancer. And it's such a you don't hear those two conversations put together very often, and yet it's reality.
And that's why I love this podcast, because this is, for me, not a pulpit conversation. This is a podcast conversation to say, what I want for our church is healthy Christian sexologists. This is who are unashamed to be a healthy Christian sexologist. And within Australia, everyone points towards one name, and that name is?
Patricia Wercoon.
Boom. Grandma sexologist. Awesome. And I'm really thankful for her championing that. I want 20 names, 30 names, 40 names. I want it to be common practice that when we get to a church, within a church of, let's say, I don't know, 100 people or more, we can say, actually, this is Jess, and she's actually our Christian sexologist. So anyone within the church who's maybe struggling with the nuts and bolts of having sex and don't know where to go to have a conversation, she's the perfect person.
You're kind of, what I'm hearing you say is it's kind of like the new mental health and church integration, like the same way we're realizing that the mental health faith integration is significant, and pastors need to have a list of Christian therapists. Like the same should be in this space too. This is the next frontier of what we've learned in the church about mental health. Sexual. We should treat sexual health the same way as we now think about mental health in the church.
If I could speak to any youth group, I would guess the thing that teenagers who have been told to abstain to a marriage, the thing that biggest excited, looking forward to, is having sex. I didn't want Jesus to come back until after I was married so I could have sex, right? Because someone gave me a heads up that apparently we don't have sex in heaven, and I was like, okay, well, I just need to get that under my belt before we go up and see Jesus. And I say that jokingly, but it was for me a big deal. I kind of want to get married before Jesus comes back. Just to experience that and have that understanding. But when that's rocky, when that's challenging, and by the way, it changes and shifts over time, I agree completely with Keller, is that if you have a rudimentary understanding of sexuality and it doesn't happen the way that you hoped it would happen, you can be rocked by that. And if you don't have a safe space where you can go to figure that out, then it stunts that whole experience for you, and it changes and shapes. Like foreplay in the beginning of our relationship was dinner out in the city, a romantic walk along the beach, flowers on the bed, and then we would make sweet, sweet love. Now it's, you fed the children, you ran them through the bedtime routine, you put them to sleep, you vacuumed the house, you've done the washing, you've packed the dishes in the dishwasher, and you've cleaned the kitchen table. Donkey's getting lucky. But that is a shift.
And by the way, are you sure the kids are definitely asleep?
We put a lock on the door for that reason. that has changed the way that we interact. Is that it's gone from a spontaneous expression of love to a planned. Do you know, like, there's some place where Sunday afternoon sex doesn't become an option anymore, and you kind of have to write it into the program.
Yep.
Nobody taught me that,
Yep.
and I wish somebody did.
Yep.
And that's the thing that I feel like is an elephant within our churches that we don't discuss.
Okay, so and I agree with you. What I'm hearing from you so far is that you're advocating very strongly to have more Christian sexologists.
Yes.
The reality is that's not the case as far as I know it at the moment.
Okay.
So where do we go from here?
So I've seen expressions. So there's a podcast called Kingdom Sexuality. It's hosted by 3 people, younger folks. It's pretty explicit, but their goal is to have a good, healthy Christian framework for sex. I think that's a really positive step in the right direction.
Yeah.
They're not experts. They're not professionally trained. They're you and me having a conversation about the nuts and bolts of sex. And I think there's something really positive about that. My guess is they've probably caught a lot of flack for that. But I think it's a healthy step in the right direction. The other thing I want to say too is I don't feel like it's an appropriate pulpit conversation.
Why not? Because not everyone's married?
Yes, that's part of it. So I think the theology of sexuality is a healthy conversation. I think the nuts and bolts of sex needs to sit somewhere separate to that, outside of that.
You still haven't given me a why though.
I think it comes down to probably my understanding of preaching.
Okay.
So my understanding of preaching is a desire to expound on Scripture and land at the feet of Jesus, ultimately, is that I would want to be the herald for the gospel, communicating that gospel message most effectively. And I feel like this is one step back from that. So
I think that's fair.
So I think it's healthy for me to have a theology of sexuality conversation from the front.
Which is relevant.
Yes. I think it's better for me to have a safe space on a Wednesday night
Yeah.
where a small amount of couples can come together and have a sexologist talk on a topic.
Well, you've just touched on something that slightly different. So I'll get to my point, but I'll tell it through a story. One of my favorite TED Talks that I've ever heard is from a Zimbabwean psychiatrist. He's a black man, and I say that with relevance because he talks about the rarity of black psychiatrists in Zimbabwe and psychiatrists in general. From memory, I think he talks about there being 7 black psychiatrists in the whole of the country of Zimbabwe.
Sweet mercy.
And so he gets up on stage and says, I'm one of the 7. I obviously believe in psychiatry as a discipline. I've given my life to it. What would you do if you were me to help my country? What would your strategy be? And what his answer is he recognizes that in Zimbabwean culture, particularly black culture, the grandma is a very important figure in not just the family unit, but the community.
Yeah.
And so he said, and I don't remember exactly what it was called, but he basically pioneers the grandma program where he teaches Zimbabwean grandmas basic mental health first aid, sits them on benches, and their office is always open for people who want to come and speak to them side by side.
Yeah.
They are not as well trained as a psychiatrist, but they're there. Why I tell that story and where I'm going with this is I wonder whether a good bridge in our churches is to have brave first followers, older couples who have seen it all, make themselves vulnerable by essentially mentoring younger couples and having conversations like this. Sure, they're not trained sexologists, but they've certainly got more runs on the board, and they can help the young couple who are going through stuff, who may think that they're the only ones, go, oh yeah, that's okay.
So you're campaigning for more Patricia Weerakoons, not less.
I'm campaigning for lay Patricia Weerakoons.
Ooh, okay.
I'm campaigning for mature brothers and sisters in the church who would put their hand up and go, let me help. And it doesn't have to be young married couples. It could be dating. It could be single people, but the point is you've got, it's basically a mentoring dynamic that we do in our churches we'd call it discipleship, or we'd read the Bible together or whatever. Maybe if there's not enough sexologists around, maybe that's the way that we can hopefully make a dent in what you're talking about, which I agree is a problem. You don't seem convinced.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge is that I end up, sitting down and reading what's his name? Learman's sheet music book, which is this nuts and bolts understanding of sex, and there's probably a few more out
so
there.
so Intended for Pleasure, and I can't remember the author, but...
Okay. So there's a few out there.
Yeah.
And so I end up trying to be the layman, but gently, I don't want to be the layman.
Why not?
Because I feel like that your pastor becomes the grab bag for every problem.
But I'm not saying it's you as the pastor doing it. I'm saying you equip a team around you to have, sensitive, respectful conversations with each other.
Do they have to be grandmas? No. Your Zimbabwean story was awesome, and I totally appreciate
the grandma analogy is just the elder statesman in your church.
Wouldn't you want them from all 5 phases of life? Like, wouldn't you want a young married sexologist, a middle-aged sexologist, a empty nester
But my point is you're not even close to that, so how do you bridge it?
I see. Okay, yes.
So the Zimbabwean psychiatrist has a problem. The reality is he's not going to find 1,000 psychiatrists overnight.
Yes, okay.
So does he throw his hands up in the air and say it's too hard? I'm saying this is the Zimbabwean psychiatrist solution in our churches.
Yes. I just want sex champions.
How's that for a service team at your church? It's the sex champion roster.
I tell you right now, it'd be the fullest roster in any church. Could you imagine? We need help with children's ministry. We've got a property team who mows the lawn. Does anyone want to be the sex champion for our church?
I'll recommend you on LinkedIn. I mean, I'll give you an endorsement if that's what you're looking for.
We had 86 people signed up to be sex champions in our church on Sunday.
And the lawn never gets mowed anymore in the grounds.
We had people walking in off the street. No one's picking up a whippersnipper again. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing for me is that I think that there's this unhealthy dynamic between this purity culture, don't do it until you're married. And there's this unhealthy level of pressure on that. And then that gets removed.
And it's like,
farewell, have a great time after your engagement party.
Yeah.
And you walk out and you walk into a bedroom and you go, it's game time. This is what I've been waiting.
But even that notion is so loaded.
Totally. And there's...
Because it's game time means it's time to perform.
Yeah. And you're like, what does this look like? How does this play? I've got this lated, stilted pornography problem that has either been addressed or hasn't been addressed or is still being addressed. And so I have an expectation. She has an expectation. And then it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And you're like, far out. It was the porn addiction. And she's like, far out, we're not compatible or something. And then you have no clue who to call, because it doesn't feel like, on a wedding night, you can reach out and ask someone for help. And I think that's, and someone's going to leave a message. It's not all about sex. Great. Thank you for that. Bless you. That's not the point. The point is that creating these spaces for Christians to have these dialogues and these conversations in a healthy place is we finally get there with depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
And I think more than your point, I want to say explicitly to everybody, I want people within our church to be willing to champion sex in a positive, non-lewd, compassionate and uplifting way that's a safe space.
Yeah.
And it's not addressed from the front.
Yeah.
I'm not preaching nuts and bolts of Song of Solomon. I will give you a theological framework. And I just find myself getting more gracious with a person later in life who has maybe had sex before they got married and just being the non-judgmental, love you, God's going to redeem this, let's figure out a way through this.
Yeah. Provide a safe space.
Provide a safe space. But I'm honestly in a panic anytime I sit down in a room with someone and it comes out there's historic sexual abuse. I'm like, oh, I weep. I don't know how to, and we get put in a place where we have to triage it.
Yeah.
And I'm panicking.
But your point is triage implies that you have someone to point someone to, and your point is we don't have anyone.
I'm like, see a counselor.
Yeah.
And it's the worst response. And I just wish I could go, on the northern beaches, the best person that I know is this person, this person, this person, this person. In fact, here's a list. So, like with right now, a lot of pastors have to have professional supervision.
Yep.
So there's the Australian Association of Qualified Supervisors. I'd like the Australian Association of Qualified Sexologists, AAQ Sex. I've already got your acronym. And I can point you to one of those fantastic people, and there's a plethora of them to pick from that you can engage with and connect with. And maybe I'm just not aware. Like maybe this already exists.
Someone chime in and tell us if there's something we don't know.
Because that's what I feel like our church needs.
But I'm just going to keep coming. But you're like, I hear you.
Yeah.
But you keep identifying a problem and you're not offering any solutions. And I feel like that's
so what? But,
I don't want to end there as an episode.
Okay, so I think, but I don't. I think that's part of the problem. Can't we just have no solution? What's if I just identify the issue,
and that's our role in this conversation,
right? So our role in the greed episode is to say, hey, guess what? White privileged Westerners with lots of money, you've got an issue with greed.
Sure.
Deal with it.
Yep.
Solve it. Protestant Christian churches, we have an unhealthy fixation on purity culture, which is leading to destructive sexual practices and not creating safe spaces for people to figure out their way through practical issues with sexuality. We need to fix it.
Yeah. And that's the point of this episode, is just to identify that without having tried solutions to it.
Yes.
The fact that there is no solution communicates the felt need of the issue.
Yes. And so for Patricia Wirracoon, if she put together a program that trained lay people to triage sexual issues and point them in the right direction, amen.
Yep.
But that is one human being. We've got a unicorn that we're assuming is going to solve our entire sex crisis, if there is one.
Yep.
And I'm saying, no, we need pastors to champion it. We need people who are going into university to say, actually, I want to train in a way that I could be a Christian sexologist. You were saying that you were at a conference where you met another lady who was potentially...
Okay, so I'll take that dovetail. So I haven't asked for her permission to name her, but I'm sure she won't mind. So Monica Cook is the name of a woman that I met. She was wonderful. Look, she was speaking in a conference situation. So she did speak a lot about the theology. She did also speak about some of the practice stuff, but I guess what I'm saying is I'm sure she would speak a lot more about the practice stuff in the one-on-one session. But A, there are other Christian sexologists out there. B, check out Monica Cook if you would like to. I was thoroughly impressed, and maybe we'll have her on at some point. But 3, she said something really interesting in her keynote theologically that I'd never thought through. She she read us 1 Corinthians 13. Now, 1 Corinthians 13 is the famous love passage.
Yep, that no one lives up to.
And theologians will love to point out the fact that it's not romantic love, and that's true. It's love within the body of Christ. It's how do you use your gifts to love others in the body of Christ, right? That's true.
So good. Yeah.
I've been at a wedding.
My eyebrow is twitching as I remember all the pastors preach on that.
I've been at a wedding reception where the pastor was criticized for using the wrong kind of love by using 1 Corinthians 13. Anyway, I digress.
That's my favorite, by the way. That's my favorite wedding passage to preach on.
That's why you're not an Anglican anymore.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
You heretic.
No, because I say you can't do this.
Yeah, sure.
Without God's help, there's no possibility for you to accomplish this. This is a miserable standard for you and you will fail hopelessly.
So it's actually a call to live out the gospel and be...
Amen. Yep.
Well, you've just...
Oh, did I?
Well done.
Sorry.
Well done. No, look, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. She says, now, just by way of context, there are three main words for love in New Testament Greek. We have one. Herein lies one of the problems that we face. We have love. Greeks have eros, philos, and agape, right? Eros, erotic, that's the sexual love. But it is not the prevailing word for love that the New Testament uses.
No.
Agape is by far and away the most common.
Yep.
Agape is a love that is expressed with service. So when Christ loves us, he agapes us.
Yep.
He obviously doesn't eros us. That's not the kind of love he's showing us. He's not erotically loving us. He's laying his life down for us. My point is, Monica Cook read 1 Corinthians 13, and instead of saying love, she inserted the word making love into 1 Corinthians 13.
Really, go
right?
read it.
She says, making love is patient. Making love is kind.
Hell yeah.
Making love does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. Making love does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. Wow, there's one. It is not easily angered.
Yeah.
It keeps no record of wrongs. Making love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth.
Yep.
Making love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres.
That
I just was like, whoa, like the theologian in me was like, whoa, like it just,
seriously, everyone wants that kind of sex.
Yeah. And her point, so I guess what I'm doing in quoting that is I totally agree with you that it can't just be a conversation around theology of sex.
Yes.
But good theology paired with good practice is a beautiful thing. Yeah. And I think sex is, we now need to take that good theology and look at good practice. And so I think coming back to the covenant language, wherever, and I'm not coming up with solutions necessarily, but it has to start with the posture of service, of self-emptying, of love of the other. And that means, I think, that it's okay to have a conversation if your partner is struggling with this. It's actually an act, as confronting as it is to be the first one to speak up. You know, I think about my own mental health journey. In many ways, I was the one that spoke up. But I knew there must be others. And I would imagine this is the same. You don't need to shout it from a mountaintop, but when you come out of the woodwork with something, not only is it liberating for you, but it actually serves others. First your spouse, but also others who are struggling with it as well. You know, I remember a couple coming to me and they hadn't had sex in 2 years because there was so much anxiety. And I just had so much respect for them. And at that time, they didn't have kids yet.
Yep.
And they were genuinely like, we may not be able to have offspring because of this sexual anxiety.
Yep.
Now, in the end, they got through that. But particularly because it was the girl who had the anxiety, for the guy who's grown up, to your point, in the hypersexualized world, he's just married the love of his life and she doesn't want to have sex with him for 2 years.
It's a big deal.
But it's real.
Yep.
And I just had so much respect for them for talking to me about that. But to your point, I could only give fairly limited counsel on that and mostly along theological lines. I couldn't give best practice sexually about how to overcome that anxiety. I just couldn't.
And that's where I think if we can forge a new space where 2 months into that relationship, they go, oh man, we've been a married couple for 2 months and this seems to be a big issue.
Yeah.
Let's go sort this. They had a clear place to go.
Yep.
They had a healthy conversation. They had the frameworks that we can't offer because, I will say I've given poor practical sexual advice previously because I didn't have a healthy understanding of it.
Yep.
And I've had to learn it as well in a place where it doesn't feel lewd. And you see it right now. There is an explosion of sexologists. They're everywhere.
Is there? I didn't even know that. Oh
gosh, man, everyone wants to be a sexologist.
Yeah.
Because people have really broken practical sex lives and they go, well, we'll go and see a sexologist and fix it. And I think that this is one place where we could scream that the philos, agape, eros combination of incredible sex and champion.
I feel like that's right. Yeah, all three in a sexual context.
Oh, but like when you serve the pleasures of your spouse, that's when the best sex is going to happen. Yeah. Which is, by the way, agape, not eros, right?
Correct. Yeah. Well, it's taking the agape into the eros.
Yeah, and so when you live out that kind of expression that you were saying in First Corinthians, which by the way is really hard to do sexually as well, much as it is in life, you're trying for the best.
Yeah.
But if you get the worst, you've actually got a place to go now, and that's I think that's the thing that I really wanted to champion is that to encourage us to creatively think about that, and I think we'll wrap it up here, but if what I'd love to happen is each week there is a link to the Discord.
I was literally going to say the same thing.
So there's a link to the Discord channel, which is starting to take off. That link expires after a week. So it's a different link on each episode. So the best way to go is to go to the most recent. That's probably the most recent link. And go to the Discord channel, because what I've been trying to do is after each episode share some of the insights and continue that dialogue. So if you're like, these two old farts don't know there's so many.
Yep. Tell us, please.
Give us a link. Let's collate them and make them available to churches and communities, whoever needs it. And let's actually build that list.
Yep.
And flesh it out some more.
Flesh it out. Really? That's strike 3, Duncan.
See you next
Time to go.